Good morning, YouTube, and welcome back to the farm. Thanks to an eagle-eyed viewer, I believe it was Ron Fitzsimmons, I could be wrong. He asked if I greased up the pilot bearing when I went and put everything back together, because he did not see me do that. And he's absolutely right. Oops. The pilot bearing is on the end of this shaft, and it goes down into the clutch slash brake drum plate, and it has to be able to spin. And I cleaned that bearing in the parts washer, and it feels good. There's no crunchiness to it or anything. It spins freely. But I didn't repack it with grease, and according to the manual, I'm supposed to go and grease the socket, the little puck that it sits inside of. So I got to take this all apart just so I can grease the end of this shaft and the bearing that's on it. So this all led to a very illuminating conversation that I ended up having with Lavoy over at jdcrawlers.com. I called him up, told him about my woes, and we got to talking about what I had done and how I'd put it back together and what I used to put it back together. And it turns out that the bolts, the fine threaded bolts with nylock nuts that I put on here are wrong. I should not have used those. And I'm supposed to use a washer underneath the heads of the bolts. So I'm gonna have to take this apart. I ordered some parts, and now I'm waiting on parts. And while we were at it, we got to talking about adjusting the clutch. And he's gonna send me a special gauge for setting the clutch, and he's gonna send me a service bulletin from John Deere that tells me exactly how to set this clutch. So it's kind of a good thing that Mr. Fitzsimmons went and made me think about this, because if it hadn't have been, I wouldn't have talked to Lavoy over at jdcrawlers.com and found out that I used the wrong nuts. I'm not using the right bolts. I don't have a washer where it needs to have a washer, and I need the feeler gauge in that service bulletin. So yeah, it's kind of a good thing. So now we're going to take this thing apart and partially put it back together, and I'm waiting on bolts and washers and nuts to come in the mail. Oh yeah, these are down pretty hard. One nut. Okay, that's two nuts off. That's three nuts off. That's four nuts off. I'm missing a nut. Now there's just barely enough space up underneath here for you to get that nut on there. And now that I've got to wait on parts, wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. course, it didn't want to come up now. I went and bought these that were exactly the right size, fine threaded. It's a shame I won't be using them. LaVoy's going to be sending me some new ones, along with the rest of the hardware to make this right. Because whoever it was that put this back together the last time did it backwards. They put the nuts on the side of the clutch, and that's not how it's supposed to go. And of course, I'm trying to put it back together correctly. There we go. And now we have the clutch off. Nice and clean. Composite disc. The metal disc. Composite disc. Now I can't get a hold of the disc. See if I can pull this out. There we go. And there's that little bearing I need to do. This little bearing right here is the one that I need to take care of. I guess it's pressed on because I don't see any snap ring or anything in it. And that's like a sealed bearing to me. But we'll pack it up anyway. I don't really need to take all the rest of those. Well, yeah, I do now that I've got them misaligned. Oh well. If anything, I want to get them out of the way so I don't get grease on them when I go and load this bearing cup. And now, through the magic of video editing, I have rubber gloves on. Get in here and see if I can pack this thing with some grease and keep it all inside that pocket. There we go. Well, I got a little bit left after all that. Got that all greased up. Now we've got that all greased up and lubed up. I've got almost too much grease tucked away down in that little socket. Now if I can just get it to sit down in the socket. There we go. Wow, that turns freer than it did. Okay. Yeah, we made a difference there. Now that I've got grease on my gloves, I definitely don't want to be handling the clutch discs. So we'll take those off. And start back. We're going to go and put in a fiber disc on the bottom first, then a metal disc above that, as if I can get it lined up. There we go. And another fiber disc with a metal disc. another fiber disc with a metal disc. And so on. And the last fiber disc. This fiber disc sits in just enough to where you can't wiggle it around outside. In other words, it just comes comes into that, but it's actually sitting up above the face of this drum just a little bit. And talking with Lavoie, he said that's normal, that's where it ought to be. Because when I took this thing apart, these fiber discs were sitting down inside of that drum, and which tells me and everybody else that they wore, they're not as thick as they used to be. And all brand new stuff, it ought to work like it's supposed to, right? Now I get to go and take this brand new clutch and set it in place, get it centered, and get it right over all of the bolt holes it needs to be. And unfortunately, that's where I have to stop, because I've got new bolts, new washers, new nuts coming, and I'm guessing a feeler gauge and a service bulletin telling me how to set this up before it goes back into the tractor. So now I get to wait on the United States Postal Service, and we know how fast they can be. So let's go find out what other kind of trouble we can get into today. I'm thinking real serious about going after the throwout bearing. When I talked to Lavoie about the throwout bearing on the phone today, we were talking about which way the throwout bearing has to face. And if I can get this thing off of here. When you look at the throwout bearing, you've got a curved side that's stamped metal and the bearing surface on the inside. And then you got one side that is a machined, flat, hard surface that's like a bearing race. That's the surface that needs to face towards the clutch fingers, because that will turn inside of this with the bearings that are inside. So that's the side that actually needs to face the clutch. The other thing we talked about is once I put it on the throwout bearing assembly, it should only have to be pushed in about 1/8 of an inch or so, and that's right. Said you ought to be able to tap that on with a hammer. However, in our discussion, this piece has to swivel around inside of here in order to actuate, and it needs to slide in and out. So this surface here I need to polish, and this surface on the inside I need to polish, so that they go back and forth together real easy. And then I need to go and put just a little bit of grease in here to make sure that it will always stay that way. And I'm thinking I'm going to probably use my Never Sees, because as he was explaining, the inside of this usually gets pretty rusty. Although I've treated it with rust treatment, it needs to be polished. So I think I might attack that later on today. At least, you know, that way I've got something to do. Thanks for hanging out with me for a little bit on the farm. I'm going to go take a break, maybe get some breakfast, and then figure out how I'm going to polish those pieces so that we can go and put the throwout bearing and everything together so that when I get these parts, I'm ready to take this thing and put it back on the tractor. Thanks for hanging out with us, and come back and see us.